This is a national security presidential memorandum that seeks to impose maximum pressure on the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
On the campaign trail, President Trump promised to return to the policy of maximum pressure on Iran.
The Iran situation, hopefully, I'm going to sign it, but hopefully we're not going to have to use it very much. We will see whether or not we can arrange or work out a deal with Iran, and everybody can live together, and maybe that's possible, and maybe it's not possible.
And on February 4th, he followed through on that promise. The Maximum Pressure campaign is a campaign of sanctions, designed to target and cripple the Iranian economy. This week, what does President Trump hope to achieve with his Maximum Pressure campaign? Are the Iranians prepared for more maximum pressure? And can both sides step away from the edge and meet in effective diplomacy? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. In his first term, President Trump made his feelings towards Iran abundantly clear. In front of the United Nations on September 24th, 2019, he said this.
In response to Iran's recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, we just imposed the highest level of sanctions on Iran's central bank and sovereign wealth fund. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened.
He withdrew from the Obama-era Iran nuclear deal and imposed a number of harsh sanctions on the country, targeting Iran's oil exports, its nuclear efforts, as well as a number of non-oil and nuclear-related entities. Over 80% of Iran's economy was targeted by Trump's sanctions, and their impact was severely felt by the Iranian people. Inflation spiraled in Iran. In June of 2016, Iran recorded a 25-year low of 9.5% inflation. But by March 2019, the International Monetary Fund was reporting that inflation had increased to 41%. By January 2020, the national currency, the Iranian rial, had lost 2/3 of its value from 2017. And in September 2020, then President Hassan Rouhani said in an interview on state television that Iran had lost $150 billion in revenue since Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal. All these numbers equate to bad fiscal news for Iran. And now we're back to the Maximum Pressure campaign. To get a sense of the sanctions, I spoke with Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute focusing on Iran, and the author of the book The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. I started by asking Alex if the Iranian regime anticipated a return to maximum pressure and what preparations they have taken.
Frankly, I think like the rest of the world, including most people here in the United States, nobody really knew what to expect from the Trump administration 2.0. It's a very different cast of characters. I mean, if you look at who's in the Trump administration, these are mostly in the positions they're in because of the fact that President Trump likes them on a personal level, trusts them, and believes that they will do his bidding, if you will, in advancing President Trump's agenda at home and abroad. So that said, when you're sitting in Tehran, you look at someone like Secretary of State Marco Rubio or National Security Advisor Mike Waltz or a long list of other names that from the past have been taking pretty hawkish positions on Iran. The fact that U.S. should take the fight to Iran and so forth. That is all true, but the Iranians, like the rest of us, didn't know whether they would get the order from President Trump to do the sort of things they're known for, or whether President Trump will go in a different direction. Because He has proven on many issues that he can surprise. So, as we were sitting here and speaking to one another this morning, we learned from the media that President Trump has asked Vladimir Putin of Russia to mediate between US and Iran. You would have asked me this question a few months ago, said, hang on a minute, who? Putin mediating? Well, that's apparently what is happening. So, again, to your question, did they anticipate any particular kind of policies from Trump administration 2.0? They probably had certain suspicions, but they also fundamentally, I think, believed that President Trump would use maximum pressure not as the first sort of salvo in the campaign to go after Iran militarily, but to force Iran to the negotiating table. Because I don't think the Iranians have really ever refused to accept the fact that this is a president who does want to deal with Iran diplomatically if he can have his way. On the question of whether they prepared themselves or not, you could certainly make the point that Iran today is in a very different place than it was in 2018 when maximum pressure first was put into play. Iran today has learned a lot over the last 7 years in terms of how to go around sanctions. They have created a network of customers out there and middlemen who are involved in the game of circumventing American sanctions. So, the fact that Iran sells 1.8, 1.9 million barrels of oil to China, and there are lots of giant tankers and insurance companies and other companies involved, tells you that there is a sanction busting network that is there today that didn't exist back in 2018. So in a sense, yes, they have improved, if you will, their hand to go around sanctions. But here's the key issue to keep in mind. It's not enough. Whatever Iran is doing is not enough. It is just barely surviving. The Iranian economy is on the brink. The Iranian media, the ones that are essentially controlled by the regime itself, are openly suggesting that protests are likely to happen at any moment because there's such an anger in Iranian society. So if I could answer that question, I would say they certainly didn't do enough to prepare for what is happening. And not everything can be, by the way, blamed on Trump. There's a lot of issues in the Iranian economy that are, the fault of the regime, the policies they've pursued, or the policies they're refusing to pursue that should be looked at, and not just looking at the role of sanctions and what President Trump does or does not do.
On that, you got the Iranian media predicting potential riots in the country because of the economic situation. Is it, quote unquote, ordinary Iranians who have been hit the worst by this? Or, have the country's sort of wealthy and elite also been hit badly by this? Because I think, they probably have a bit more say in who is at the top of the country and the ruling the country than ordinary Iranians do.
I haven't been in Iran for 20 years, but I follow Iran daily because that's what I do from a distance. So I can't really speak to what Iranian society is going through today because I'm not in the streets. But as somebody who's been watching Iran for literally a quarter of a century and happens to have been born in Tehran and know the culture, know the society, speak the language and all the rest of it, all I'm hearing from people in Iran, the ones who are still in Iran, the ones who recently left Iran, and the large Iranian diaspora, that everybody's hurting because of the state economy. Poor, the middle class, the rich, everybody's feeling the impact. Obviously, if you're at the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum in terms of your wealth, you have that much of more of a cushion to deal with the sanctions. And if you're at the other end of the spectrum, you get hit hard. You get hit hard because the price of bread goes up, you're in trouble. The other guy at the other end of the spectrum might be concerned about whether he gets the latest iPhone. So there are different, ways of looking at this issue. But I also have to add, it's the poor classes in Iran that that's the segment of society that has been expanding in size, not the wealthy class. That's been certainly diminishing in size. So you have, again, just going by the words of President Masoud Pezeshkian, who just said on Sunday, millions of people have joined the line of the poor in Iran over the last couple of years. So poverty has been increasing in terms of numbers. The only class of people, and this is surely can only be a tiny group of people or segment of society, that have more or less sort of maybe even benefited from the state of affairs are those people who engage in sanction busting, the
Mm.
ones that benefit from sanctions being in place, the middlemen. If you talk to Iranians and ask them who are these middlemen, if they had to point the finger at one group, it would be the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, if we go by their acronym. They are the
Mm.
ones who have the connections, the facilities to engage in large-scale smuggling and so forth. So they smuggle, for example, oil to various customers, obviously at a discounted rate, and oftentimes the money mostly is kept by themselves, does not flow to the people. So, it's not a pretty black and white picture as such. There are different nuances to this, but the question of who is suffering in Iran, I would say pretty much everyone in Iran, with those very tiny exceptions I mentioned,
Mm.
are feeling the impact of the state of the economy being as bad as it is today.
Sanctions can play two ways for those people who are suffering. They can say it's the fault of the US administration, they are imposing the sanctions, or they could say it's the Iranian government who are funding foreign militias, continuing and expanding nuclear programs, etc., etc. So, how is that view playing out, do we think, amongst the Iranian population? Who do they hold responsible for these sanctions ultimately? Or is it both?
I think the Iranian nation, this country of 90 million people that has lived under the rule of the Islamic Republic for 46 years, today has come to conclude that to blame the outside, blame the United States or Britain or somebody else for what is happening in Iran is to miss the point. It's whatever analogies you want to use, not to see the forest for the trees.
Mm.
It's the policies of a regime that is hell bent on going down the path it's chosen to go on. And when people point out, listen, this is the wrong path, well, who's listening? Certainly not Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader. And, we can talk about what the regime leaders get wrong in terms of what they're doing in the region, the nuclear program, the missiles that has created so much anxiety in the region and internationally. But put that aside for a second. Are they doing much better in terms of domestic policies? Are they doing anything that's good, at least in the eyes of the Iranian people? And my answer to that is no. They're tone deaf. I mean, let me give you an example. This whole business of the mandatory veil.
Mm.
Mandatory veil, where you literally force women to put on the veil when they go out in the public. If that's not a case of a regime that's lost touch with its own people, then I don't know what else we can point to. Certainly, the younger generation have no time. Again, with the few exceptions of people, that about 15% of Iranian society that is more or less aligned with this regime for different reasons. A smaller group, probably for ideological reasons, they still believe in the cause of the revolution of 79.
Mm.
Many more are in this regime supporting business because they get their basically salaries, or they're in part of this machinery. They need this regime for the everyday lives. But your vast majority Iranian society today is aware that yes, the Americans are looking after themselves, they're looking after their interests, or their interest of their friends like Israel and others. But end of the day, we have a regime that doesn't even listen to us on things that are inside of our country's borders, things that have nothing to do with the outside world. And that, I think, is the problem. So when you're looking at who to blame, you blame a soon to be 86-year-old supreme leader who's been there since 1989
Mm.
and who has for decades refused to listen to calls for change. Domestic policies that need to be changed, obviously, also in terms of foreign policy, because Khamenei's policies have brought Iran to this kind of a isolated place where it is on the world stage today.
Mm. You mentioned things like the mandatory veil there, as a very deeply unpopular policy. I think the popularity of the regime has been going down for a number of years. Obviously, most notably the protests following the murder of Massa Gina Amini, low turnout local elections. We also saw more recently, let's say, the rejection of the regime's or the Ayatollah's probably preferred candidate at the presidential election. That all sort of points to the regime being um, domestically quite weak. But I think it's also a common trope of this regime where people, particularly people on the outside, talk about its weakness, and yet it's always still there. And prophecies of its end generally come to naught. So, where does this stand now? Because it does look weaker than it's ever been, and yet it's still there. Does it have enough popular support within the country? Or dare I say, do we look at the beginning of the end?
Look, we have to be very humble and careful when it comes to those big predictions in terms of whether this system will prevail or collapse. And we just have to look to Syria just a couple of months ago. Who would have said Assad would crumble the way he did, having half his family in power for over half a century? So one way of answering that question is to say the Iranian regime is certainly desperately weak when it comes to the question of whether they're legitimate. I would say nobody would argue against that. I would say people who support the Iranian regime in Iran will tell you that they're facing a legitimacy crisis. I said just a few minutes ago, 15% probably supports this regime. 15%. Go back to 1979 when this regime was born, it was probably over 50%. And it's taken half a century almost to come to a point where the regime tent is being shrinking ever more to the point where there is only, as I said, a fraction of the Iranian society that is supported of it. But we have to remember the 15%, it's the 15% with the access to the guns, access to the prison cells, access to whatever surveillance equipment you need to listen to people, monitor people, look after in terms of looking and going and picking them up and put them in a prison cell. That's the 15%. So in that sense, it's still very much a repressive and effective repressive machinery. How effective will it be going forward? Would more people from the regime continue to defect? Because that's one of the big parts of the conversation. People are defecting because the regime, for different reasons, ideologically has lost more and more, financially is incapable of looking after more or providing patronage. So it's been a one-way street as far as I can tell you. The evolution has been one of the regime shrinking to a point where, if tomorrow this Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who just came to power just last year, hasn't been there long, had his first cabinet minister impeached by a hardline controlled parliament, Majlis, and he said on Sunday, there are things I can't do. He was specifically talking about whether U.S. and Iran should pursue diplomatic talks, and he said, I am for it, but I can't because the leader has said no. So you got this whole structural issue. Everyone knows this is a regime that's lost its way. People who Khamenei himself have paved the way to become president, like Pezeshkian, openly say we've lost our way. We need to do things differently. And yet the system today, structured in a way, we're turning the corner or changing your ways is so much harder than it should be. The question is, will they be able to change their ways before it's too late? Or would the next set of protests in Iran, really take off in ways we haven't seen perhaps since 1979, where it becomes a movement that this regime, despite its abilities to repress, will lose its ability to do so. And then we could see a scenario where we can then talk about the fall of the Islamic Republic. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. But the sort of, if you will, the writing is on the wall.
You talked about how during the previous sort of maximum pressure campaign, and I think even during the Biden administration, there was still sanctions. Sanctions did exist against Iran, and yet you had, as you said, 1.8 million barrels of Iranian oil being taken to China, sanction busting, quite a big business. A lot of those, as I understand it, sanction busting routes and businesses rely on other foreign countries, I think particularly the UAE. Do you think we can maybe anticipate those sanction busting loopholes to be closed by countries like the UAE or other nations to either appease the US, and we've got quite a hostile government in the US now to appease those sorts of people, or I think will they carry on as they have been?
My bigger kind of lesson that I've learned talking to folks who are in the Biden administration is that President Biden really didn't try to revive JCPOA of 2015. And he's essentially, as you said, continued the maximum pressure campaign that was launched by Donald Trump in late 2018. So Biden's heart was never in it. And I think, that's something I've certainly picked up from talking to folks who are in the Biden administration. Did he implement the sanctions on Iranian, say, oil exports? Probably not. That was the unspoken agreement between Tehran and Washington. I will limit, I meaning Islamic Republic of Iran, their nuclear activities to certain limits. And even though they were in breach of the JCPOA from 2015, they would enrich to 60%, but no more. So they would make a point, but they wouldn't go all the way to a point where, it becomes impossible for Biden not to do anything. So we were operating this gray zone, whereas Biden and his team would look away essentially from Iranian oil exports to China, and the Iranians would, push the envelope, if you will, that much, not all the way. I mean, there are other factors that played in here. For example, we have to remember the Russian invasion of Ukraine really created a lot of turbulence in the global oil market. So the Biden administration wanted to stabilize the price of oil to the extent possible. To go after Iran's oil exports would not have been helpful in terms of keeping the prices relatively low. And that was one factor, for example, where U.S. decided not to implement the oil sanctions. So there are different ways of looking at the issue of why Iran was able to export sanctions under the Biden administration. I think, if the United States today, with the Trump administration, comes out and says, absolutely, if you're involved, any country, any company involved in the trade of Iranian oil, we will come after you and come after you hard. I'm sure that will make a difference to a lot of countries and companies that we know have been involved as middlemen. But will China listen? That's the big question. China gets 95% of Iran's oil exports goes to China. That's the one customer that makes a difference. And I'm looking at the issue of U.S.-Chinese relations at the moment with the tariff wars and all this talk about China as the big threat. If you're sitting in Beijing, you have to ask the question, what motive do they have to help the United States bring Iran down to its knees, with the Chinese in full knowledge that Iranian society is not a pro-Chinese society, it's a pro-American society. So if the regime changes in Tehran, Iran will go back and be a part of essentially the Western-dominated sphere of influence, if you will, and give up on China, which has been what Ali Khamenei has been pursuing so eagerly for the last few years, if not decades. So the issue going forward in Iranian oil exports essentially really hinges on what China will do, because that's the one customer Iran has left, right? And we have to ask the question, what is it for the Chinese? Perhaps they could get something out of it. Maybe the Americans can cut a deal with China or even Russia on the question of Iran. But that all remains to be seen. And we, as I said at the very outset, with President Trump, the creative diplomacy seems to have no limits to it. So we'll have to wait and see.
I think there are obvious steps that the Iranian regime could make to appease the US, end its nuclear program, stop missiles, stop funding Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc. I think that's what the US would want. Is there anything else that Iran could offer the US to lift sanctions that maybe is outside of that scope? Do we think that Iran is actually interested at all in actually making a deal with the US? I think particularly in light of the war on Gaza and the US support for Israel, ongoing support for Israel. And then sort of the other side of that, if sanctions are not having the desired effect that they want, which is, effectively to bring quite radical change in Iran by economic force, is there something else that the US administration could be doing to prompt change in Iran, which isn't bombing Tehran?
Let me start off by saying, as far as I can tell, the leadership in Tehran does not go to bed every night worried about whether Hamas or Hezbollah will survive or not. They worry if the Islamic Republic will survive in Iran. That's the primary concern. So it's very narrow in that sense. And if they continue to be on this path, because this is a path or situation that's been essentially forced on them because of events since October 7th, 2023, with the Hamas attack on Israel. They are weaker today. They are less likely to, come out and give bombastic speeches about how the future of the Middle East is now in Iran's hands. All that talk is now gone out of the window. They don't talk like that. Now it's a question of can Iran stand up and defend itself against, as you said, a potential American attack on if that ever happened. The leadership in Tehran are worried about their own survival. They are looking at a region that is in a very different place than it was just a few years ago. Iran's gamble on investing in hard power meaning missiles, drones, proxies, paid quite well during the first few years post-Arab Spring, particularly in places like Syria, where they were able to preserve Assad and continue to claim to have a bridge from Tehran to Beirut and so forth, the axis of resistance as we know it. But the axis of resistance turned out to be a bit of a paper tiger. It collapsed pretty fast once the pressure was put on them. And now Iran and its leadership have to make a decision. Do they want to go back and reinvest money they don't have at a time when their own people hate what they're doing in the region? Or should they change course? I don't think they've made a decision yet. And I think this is very important for the regional actors in the West to recognize that this is an important juncture for the regime. And if you use the right, set of incentives and carrots and sticks, if you will, you might get Iran to go in a direction that would be good for the West, certainly, for a majority of countries in the region, countries like in the Gulf states and so forth. And actually would be good for Iran, because Iran that is in the region in pursuit of this sort of open-ended, forever a war, ideological crusade against Israel, United States, is not in the interest of the Iranian people, who, by the way, really don't seem to have any, I say, obviously not all Iranians, but I would say vast majority of Iranians really wanted at this point to turn their attention inward and do some nation building for change instead of having suitcases of dollars being sent from Tehran to Beirut to give to Hezbollah supporters in the hope that that will keep Iranian influence alive. But the question today is Iranian influence alive in, say, Lebanon or in Yemen or somewhere else in the region, to what end? And that's where the Iranian regime today is struggling, because they might, and they did win the battles when it came to the sort of the proxy warfare. They kept Assad alive. They would tell you they defeated ISIS and so forth. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that's all true. But what about the day you won the conflict militarily? What happens then? And this is where Iran has come badly, embarrassingly empty. For example, in Syria, they weren't able to point to a single economic project that they would say, this is actually generating revenue for Iran. Who was making money in Syria? The Turks were, the Gulf states were, others, but not Iran. Iran was not making money out of it. And you could apply the same kind of approach in terms of study where Iran has been in the region, and you see that's true pretty much everywhere, that it's been a drain on the coffers of the Iranian regime, and the return has not been there. So it's an Iranian regime that has, because of its nuclear program, its regional activities, created this pariah status for itself. It is an untouchable when it comes to foreign firms that otherwise would love to operate in Iran. So they're sacrificing their economy, if I could just focus on that issue for a second, sacrificing their economy, not just domestically, but they don't actually have anything to show forward their regional agenda in terms of economic benefits that they get in the region, because there are none. There are none. So again, I think to your question of like, what can Trump do? What can Iran do? President Trump and his team could maybe give the Iranian regime some tough love, not the sort of tough love that President Trump handed out to President Zelensky in the White House. It has to be much more subtle, given cultural, political sensitivities that exist in the case of Iran. But the message has to be, look, if you genuinely want to put the survival of your regime first, beyond anything else, then these are the things you have to do. Talk to us. Don't talk to us in the sense of, you're proud, and because you're proud, you won't agree to any major changes. You won't do anything other than what happened in 2015 between Iran and Obama administration. President Trump needs to be able to say he got a better deal. That's his bottom line. He needs to look at himself in the mirror and say, I got a better deal than Obama did in 2015. Now, Iran can help Trump in that sense. How the Iranians approach Trump is extremely important. But I also have to say, how Trump approaches Iran is extremely important. Anybody who expects Khamenei to go to the White House or Trump to go to Tehran are mistaken. They don't understand neither country. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
A successful deal will happen between these two countries in terms of the lower level diplomats who are sitting in third countries in Europe or Middle East and cutting reaching deals that can hopefully be implemented and make these two countries turn the corner, if you will. And my reading of the situation as we're speaking right now is that's what President Trump wants. The Iranians are keen. Let's see where it's going to go from now onwards.
You mentioned about how, let's say, foreign projects, Iranian foreign projects, have come back with essentially no economic returns. Yeah, Hezbollah in Lebanon, they took a very big hit from their war with Israel. Hamas in Gaza, let's say, all but gone, really, and effectively. Assad, notoriously has now gone from Syria. Are these, all Iranian-supported elements across the region? With those gone, how big of a step back regionally is that for Iran? Or sort of underneath that and underneath the surface of all that, do they actually still retain any regional strength, do we think?
Look, it's a country 3 times the size of France with a population of 90 million people and a history of about 5,000 continuous years of a Persian empire that became Iran. So
Mm.
Iran is part of the Middle East. It will always be strong. But what I think this regime has done is to invest in terms of soft power and also hard power, in the wrong kind of, on the wrong accounts, I think. Iran was probably the first country to go in the use of proxy warfare, what the Iranian regime calls forward defense, i.e., fight your enemies outside of the borders of Iran so you don't have to fight them in Iran. It was the first country that kind of came up with that concept in a way, certainly after Arab Spring, in places like Syria.
Mm.
But Iran was not the only country that was using proxies. And in fact, if you look at Syria, Iran never occupied Syria the same way the Turks occupied northern Syria. So Turkey was engaged in a proxy war in the same kind of fashion in many ways that Iran was. But the Turks, being a NATO member and being quiet about some of their policy differences with say the United States or Israel, they could get away with it. They didn't get all the limelight, the attention. The Iranian regime, because they love to scream so loud about how holy they are, they were always under the microscope. They were always getting the attention. And the other thing about them and the use of proxy approach was that they came in early, they came in heavy, they were successful, and they stayed all the way to the very end. I mean, they literally stayed to a few hours before Assad had departed Syria for Moscow. But in that interim, when the Arab Spring erupts and Assad falls, a number of other countries were involved in Syria in terms of a proxy war agenda. The Gulf states, most of them were involved in one way or another. I mentioned the Turks just a few minutes ago, obviously the Russians, Israelis. But what happens is a lot of those countries decided at some point that it wasn't worth investing in. Particularly the Gulf countries decided this wasn't worth their time and money. The returns were going to be uncertain and limited at best. Iran was the one that stayed the course to the very bitter end, I think. And again, to a point I made earlier, this is a moment for them to maybe rethink the whole regional strategy, focus on economic power, because I cannot point to a country that is viable as a power with a very weak economy. And that's exactly what Iran is today. They have missiles and drones. The proxy war militant friends are today big question marks. So they got the drones and the missiles that can take him so far. We saw that with the attacks on Israel. So why not turn around? Why not listen to your own people? Why not focus on economic development? Why not, engage folks like President Trump, who, by the way, has, if you listen to President Trump, he has accepted an Iranian nuclear program. His only red line is no Iranian nuclear weapon. Right there, you have the framework for a deal between Tehran and Washington. But again, you have a man called Ali Khamenei, who's been there since 1989, who has invested so much in his anti-American worldview. Can he come down from that high horse of his and accept some basic realities and change course? Again, you have every right to be skeptical. I am most of the time, but I also know, as someone who knows Iran's history, that this is a regime that wants to survive. This is a regime that in 1988 signed a ceasefire with Saddam when they had said for the previous 6 years they wouldn't. So again, I think the last thing anybody wants to see is a major war in the Middle East involving Iran and the United States. That's certainly terrible news for everyone. So with that said, and I'm being maybe cynical, a lot of your listeners might say he's not talking about human rights. He's not talking about how Trump could bring about the end of the Islamic Republic and replace it with secular democracy. I would love to see that myself on a personal level, but I don't see anybody with that kind of a agenda that is seriously taken in Washington or in Europe. For that reason, I limit myself to the discussion what can be done between this Iranian regime and this new Trump administration that, at least on paper, both are saying they want to negotiate.
On the subject of negotiations, and if the Ayatollah is going to come down from his high horse, does that path instinctively go through Russia? I mean, we said right at the top that, President Trump has asked Russia to mediate between the US and Iran. I would have thought that, both the US and Iran are going to be looking at this going, I'm great friends with Russia, so I'll benefit more from this. Whereas obviously that's, probably not the case. One side will benefit more than the other. How reliant do we think Iran is on Russia to be their conduit to the outside? And obviously Russia was heavily involved in Syria, like the Iranians, as we've spoken about. With the Assad regime over, has that also, hit their personal relationship between Iran and Russia?
Vladimir Putin and Ali Khamenei have known each other on a personal level for 25 years. Putin has visited Khamenei repeatedly, whereas Khamenei has never left Tehran since he became supreme leader. So the Russians know how to play the Iran card, and they're willing to actually, elevate Iran's role in the region, massage Iran's ego, because they see Iran as a card they can play, and they have repeatedly done so in their separate U.S. American or Russian American or Russian, Western in general negotiations. We saw that throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. I mean, people forget, I believe Russia voted against Iran's nuclear program on 4 different occasions in the sort of 2008 to 2011-12 period. So Russia has a mixed record when it comes to Iran, at least seen from the Iranian regime's point of view. The idea that they trust the Russians to do good for Iran, I think that's not the case, certainly. But if there's nobody else that can mediate, although that's not true either, because we know countries like Qatar, Oman, Iraq, others, and including the Europeans who are holding talks with the Iranian officials in Europe these days, a lot of people can mediate. But Putin could certainly try. Will that do it for the Europeans, given the bad blood these days between Europe and Russia? I don't know. But the point is this, to your original and core question, does sort of the path to de-escalation between Iran and US go through Moscow? The answer is not necessarily. It doesn't have to. And if it did, it would be a limited de-escalation, because if you want genuine de-escalation with the United States, if you're Iran, there are 2 issues you need to adjust. One is this notion that you want to push the United States out of the Middle East. Iran has to stop talking that talk. That does not do them any good. And accept the fact that most of Iran's neighbors actually welcome, including Iraq, Gulf states, want a United States military presence because they consider that to be part of sort of stability for the region. Whatever you think of what the U.S. did in Iraq or Afghanistan, countries, the ruling elite in places like the Gulf states, they want the United States there. It is something they want. So that's number one. Number two is the Islamic Republic's position in Israel. I mean, that's probably the most important issue. If Iran tomorrow didn't necessarily join the Abraham Accords or even, said that it would diplomatically recognize Israel, but stop its promise to destroy Israel and stop its pledge that it will arm and finance any group that wants to go to war with Israel. If Iran did that, that will take us a long way towards something that would be much more acceptable to the Americans. And this is just a part of political reality in Washington. Plenty of people, majority of members of the United States Congress, are looking at the Iran issue through that Israeli prism. So if Iran doesn't change course on that, they could have 5 more nuclear agreements with the United States, but the fundamental animosity between Washington and Iran will not go away. So again, a lot of these things are essentially requiring it takes 2 to tango, but there's some hard, compromises that I'm not even sure if Khamenei would want to do while he's alive. He presumably want to die before he does that because it will be such a public humiliation for him. But the folks who might take over from Khamenei in Iran, they know exactly what needs to be done to bring the levels of tensions between U.S. and Iran much lower than we are today and have been in recent years.
Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar El Phil. The New Arab Voice is taking a short break, but when we return, we'll have something very special for you, so keep an eye out for further details. You can subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops, and until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on X and Instagram, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.